Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about movies, music, art, and culture. And today we're going to be taking another retrospective look, this time at the album from Bastille, Bad Blood. Now here's something you might not know about me. I'm a big follower of the Billboard Hot 100 charts. I just find them surprisingly fascinating in a perverse sort of way, watching what gets airplay and mainstream success thanks to nebulous rankings that are plagued by changes in policy, odd editorial direction, and sometimes just outright mistakes. The funny thing is that this music industry has something of a love-hate relationship with the Billboard throughout the ages. They both need each other to survive to some extent, particularly in the mid to late 90s where things got the worst, where the record industry carefully manipulated the charts throughout their carefully timed signal releases. And then you have cases like earlier this year where Billboard finally decided to include YouTube streams as a response to Gangnam Style being blocked for weeks by a lousy Maroon 5 song that, let's face it, wouldn't have gotten airplay in any other climate. And then went for the goddamn Harlem Shake for number 1 for 5 weeks this year. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that every week I make a point of going through the Hot 100 and checking out what I might have missed. As I said, I've got a populist streak, and it makes sense to be engaged on what's on the charts because ultimately those are the songs that end up mattering. And in the course of doing so, I've noticed a few anomalies on the charts, songs that sound a little out of place, intriguingly so in a way. And one of those songs comes from the act that I'm going to talk about today, Bastille. Now, Bastille is a band that falls into an intriguing category for me. Indie rock bands that music critics don't want to cover, and yet are widely liked somehow by the mainstream, otherwise known as silent majority acts. This year, the acts that sort of fit that bill are bands like the 1975, or Bastille, or The Neighborhood. And it often seems like music critics only review these bands with the strongest of trepidation. And to be fair, it's not hard to see why. These are acts that are being pushed towards the mainstream by the label, and with the right single or Glee cover, they could rapidly become massive hits and big money spinners for the label. This happened in 2011 with Foster the People, it happened in 2012 with Fun, and now it's clear the label are looking to recreate that success this year. And some critics do resent this because they feel these bands are just shallow facsimiles on what authentic indie music actually is. Now, the argument regarding what is artistically authentic or underground these days with the rise of the internet has gotten insanely convoluted and more than a little stupid, so let me drop my solitary, unimportant opinion here. I'm going to be making any sort of authenticity judgment based upon the music and the lyrics, not some hypothetical indie criteria or whether or not Pitchfork slobbers all over them. And since I do have a stronger pop sensibility than most, and I need more time to get through Dream Theater's discography, I'm going to be taking a look at Bastille's debut album Bad Blood in a retrospective here. Does it rise above its silent majority status into something truly special? Maybe. To be honest, this album was a little bit better than I did expect, but I was not blown away by Bastille's Bad Blood. Look, don't get me wrong, it's not bad and it's not offensive, but it's the kind of album I can only really recommend with a lot of serious qualifications here. To be honest, the band that jumped into my mind when I started listening to Bastille wasn't any of the silent majority acts that I had already mentioned, but Mumford & Sons of all people, the impressively mediocre folk act that I've already railed against in previous video. I mean, booming production, hook-friendly instrumentation, male choral vocals with just enough charisma to be listenable, and lyrics that really are less interesting than you'd think they are at first glance. It's almost a perfect comparison. And of course the label wants to push Bastille in that direction and with that possible lead-in. With the success of Mumford & Sons, who wouldn't want a younger, presumably hipper version of that band? Now, to be fair to Bastille, as a band they have a very different sound than Mumford & Sons, with a lot more electronic synths and a lot more heavier a cappella elements. While Mumford & Sons were trying and attempting to be very organic, Bastille is proudly touting the indie electronica genre, which at least strikes me as more honest than their predecessor and inspiration. But this is also where we run into the first big issue with this album. The electronic elements just feel glaringly out of place when set against the organic instrumentation, and especially the choirs. Now look, the production is cohesive enough to bring things together, but at best the thick, lumbering backbeats aren't that obtrusive, but some of the more grating, blaring synths closer to the top of the mix, they just don't meld well with the violins or the guitars. It's no surprise that my favorite songs on this album are much closer to the richer, more orchestral, more chamber pop stylings of songs like Pompeii and Daniel Naden and Laura Palmer and even Icarus. Honestly, I think this album could have been much stronger as an indie folk a cappella record in comparison to what they did here, especially considering some numbskull in the production studio thought auto-tune would be a good idea here on tracks like Get Home. And really, the last thing you want on an album with heavy choral arrangements is auto-tune. And look, as for the vocals, I actually don't have that many complaints. The multi-tracking, the choral vocals are often very strong, and lead singer Dan Smith has a very rich voice with a fair amount of charisma and personality. However, his voice is definitely weak in his upper range, and I had to wince anytime he jumped into his falsetto. It just didn't sound very clean getting that high, as if he hadn't had a lot of practice hitting those notes. For the most part, however, though, his vocals were never all that grating, and while I did find the dour, serious humorlessness of the band a little bit frustrating at points, it was never actively offensive. If anything, though, I kind of wish it was, because despite the multi-track vocals and wall of sound that Bastille attempts to create here, with pounding beats and the heavy choirs that sound imported from a fantasy movie soundtrack, Bastille manages to render itself a surprisingly anonymous band, and this takes us to the lyrics. Make no mistake here, they aren't bad by any stretch of the mind, or at least on a technical level, but they are bland, lacking wit and flair or any sense of humor. The best thing that I can say is that there are a few interesting references throughout the songs. I like the Icarus metaphor for alcohol abuse. I was kind of amused by the willful deflection in Pompeii, and as a fan of Twin Peaks, I definitely like the tribute song Laura Palmer. But outside of that, this album just does not stand out lyrically in comparison with a dozen other bands that are looking to do this very same formula. Part of the problem comes from the choice of the subject matter, because the album title wasn't lying. Bad Blood is, for the most part, an album about ruined relationships and all the toxic feelings that come with them. And look, while I don't object to this choice of topic, I don't think Bastille handles it all that well, mostly because the band sounds entirely too reserved and proper, as if they're really above the very emotions which they're singing about. And sure, the logical part of me can appreciate that approach, but you feel that a certain amount of emotional nuance is lost along the way. Considering that Dan Smith doesn't really show much vulnerability or deeper emotion beyond the barest minimum, plus the bombast of the choral vocals with a very masculine presence, well, it makes the album come across more than a little pompous, and gotta be honest, it's a bit obnoxious at points. It's also no surprise here that the songs I actually liked on Bad Blood were stepping away from that theme of toxic, ruined relationships and into other subject matters entirely, which I think Bastille actually handle a fair bit better. So, with all that in mind, can I recommend Bad Blood by Bastille? To be honest, I find it really hard to recommend this album. Don't get me wrong, there are elements that are aesthetically impressive. The vocals have a lot of energy, the hooks are decent enough, but the poor choices in electronica, the lackluster lyrics, and the poorly executed choice of subject matter just leeches a lot of personality out of this album. It's not a particularly long album, at least in terms of the timing, but it feels a lot heavier, slower, and longer than it should, and that's never a good sign. Look, I get why this band is appealing, and if anything I told you about today was enough to hook you, you'll probably like Bad Blood by Bastille. But really, it's not an album that I'm going to remember a week from now, and that's never going to earn it a good recommendation from me. It's a 6 out of 10 for me, and even that I feel is being generous. If you're interested, take a look. It's not going to actively offend you, but at the same time, if you're not interested, you might as well skip this album. It's not going to impress you that much. So yeah, can't imagine this review will go over well, but I find myself saying that with a lot of these reviews, and they turn out to go over better than I expected. So, what do I know? Thanks a lot for watching, I really do appreciate it. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums you'd like me to take a look at, even retrospectively, although I will comment that I prefer doing retrospectives to albums that actually came out this year. Going a little bit further back, I just don't have time for it this time. But if you want me to take a look at any albums that came out this year, I'd be more than happy to take a look. Until then, see you next time.